Hi everyone, Grover Neville here today, and we're going to be talking about the Meze Poet headphone. Now, Meze's been releasing a lot of new headphones in the last couple of years, and this is kind of a new generation of what I think of as their sort of mid-range line of headphones. So they've got the entry-level headphones, which were the 99 Classics back in the day. Now, of course, they have the Empyrean and Elite at the top of the line, and this falls somewhere in the middle, somewhere like where a Lyric might fall. This headphone is an open back headphone, and is priced at about $2,000, so a little bit different than the Lyric, but kind of in that same category of the mid-range of Meze's lineup.
Many audiophiles are not aware that our review team evaluates over 300 audio products each year. Our Substack channel is the place to find the reviews that you won't find on YouTube or in the Absolute Sound magazine. In addition, on Substack, we have a weekly Q&A session for readers with our experts, along with music articles and science of note. A link to subscribe is on screen or in the description.
Now, it does use a lot of similar parts to other Meze headphones. We've got that Renaro driver, of course, this driver that's used in cooperation with Renaro. And we've got a lot of the similar industrial design cues as other Meze headphones. So this is going to be a planar magnetic headphone. It's going to be 55 ohm impedance. And you'll see a lot of other things that are similar. So like their excellent cable. I really like the cables that Meze has for their headphones. They're really nice braided cables. They have kind of a matte feel to them. They're very high quality, and in general, I think they do a really nice job with the cables. Let's talk a little bit about the actual headphone itself in terms of build quality. This is kind of what we've come to expect from Meze. I really like them. They're well made. There's nice quality of materials. The metals and plastics that they use are always very high quality. They don't feel like they're real resonant or ringy or cheap. There's kind of an interesting sort of pattern on the back of this, which is technically an open back headphone, but it's got this kind of grill. Again, things seem to be fairly good in terms of mechanical build and design. It's not the craziest I've ever seen. I know some people have said with this particular headphone, they found some creaking in the headband and things like that. I didn't find that to be a problem at all with this particular headphone. I had no issues at all with it, either on the head or in use in various places. And it's been a fairly temperature up and down sort of summer here in Los Angeles. So, but for me, there was no issues with any sort of creaking or mechanical build issues. Yeah, they use similar sliders as you'll see on other Meze headphones that are kind of a sort of friction style slider. Works fine for me. Ear openings on the cups. Totally fine for me as well. Some people have commented in the past that they found them a little bit small on these headphones. I don't think that's a problem, but I also do not have gigantic ears. So I would say in general, I think if you have anywhere in the average to larger size ear category, you'll probably be fine with these. Now let's talk a little bit about what's going on the inside of these headphones. So the ear pads, as you can see, are magnetic and removable. You can take those right off and put them right back on very easy. So in here, we've got the Renaro driver, which you can kind of see. And it's a bit unlike any other planar magnetic driver, right? That voice coil design is not completely symmetrical and linear in every way, right? So it's got this kind of circular pattern down at the bottom and then kind of a more oval shape up at the top. So kind of an interesting design from Renaro. They're also using something, there's a little badge for it, AMTS, which you may be familiar with if you follow brands like Dan Clark Audio or other brands and headphones, or potentially KEF, as they've made some use of this kind of technology before. So essentially what AMTS is referring to is acoustic metamaterial. And in this case, it's specifically being used for what is functionally a waveguide. For those of you who are familiar with speakers using waveguides, it puts basically a mechanical filter in front of the driver, and it allows you to tune it in different ways. It's a very clever way of tuning headphones. Like I said, Dan Clark in the past has used it. Dan Clark Expanse is actually one of my reference headphones, uses it, and it can be a really, really effective and awesome tool. Now, one thing it does also do is it can create a non-flat impedance in headphones which might otherwise have a flat impedance. So planar headphones, if you're familiar with them, generally have pretty much a ruler flat impedance. It looks like it was drawn, with a straight edge. In this case, the Poet actually doesn't have a completely flat impedance fixed at 55 ohms. It drops in the treble and sort of upper mid-range area. Now, what this means and what I found in practice is that if you use it with a tube amplifier, you are going to see a slightly different response in the top end compared to something like a low output impedance solid state amplifier or a tube amplifier, which has a low output impedance tap available. So all of that is to say, this is expressly for the purpose of tuning the frequency response of this headphone. So as you can see, you've got sort of different chambers, different sizes, there's different shapes, all that sort of stuff. That goes into tuning resonances, removing resonances, tuning frequency response, and just mechanically kind of altering the headphone to get it where you want, hopefully with less EQ. So let's talk a little bit about Meze's kind of approach with these headphones. Now, I think for those who are familiar with something like the Empyreans and Elites, this is definitely going to be in the realm of Meze's house sound. You're going to see a broadly linear response in frequency from the low bass all the way up to the mid-range. It's going to be relatively flat. There's not a sub-bass boost, but it's going to be relatively flat up until the mid-range. Then there's going to be that characteristic, I think of it as kind of characteristic, Meze dip around the upper mid-range. This headphone, I would say it's centered around 2K, and that 2K dip will kind of create a little bit more sense of spatiality in the headphones at the expense of not having 100% truthful or sort of accurate presentation of soundstage, but it does get the sound out of your head a little bit more. And then as we go up into the further treble, you'll see a gently falling response, and then somewhere in the upper treble between say 12 and 14, maybe 12 and 13K, there's a relatively modest sort of peak up there. And Meze tends to do this to add sort of a sparkle to their headphones. And I think it's a very clever tuning in general. Something like the Empyrean and the Elite, I think do this really well. For listeners who are accustomed to speakers, this can be a great tuning because when we first put on headphones, as someone who might be familiar with 2-channel, you get this sense that everything is very closed in and you've lost a lot of the soundstage, right? With this headphone, the perception of that 2K region being a little depressed and then having a little sparkle on the very top end, it gives you those spatial cues up in the very, very high treble where it's really just harmonic information. But it also kind of gives you a little extra spatiality, a little more distance from things like vocals in that 2K range, which is going to be where a lot of vocal formants sit that give the sort of perception that vocals are present and forward, right? So overall, the concept of the tuning is not a bad idea. And the way they've accomplished it with this AMTS system is something that a lot of other headphones have done very successfully. Now, where it starts to go a little haywire, though, is that for whatever reason, because AMTS creates kind of a relative impedance imbalance with regards to how it's filtering the sound, everyone may not respond entirely differently. Now, if you look at graph measurements of this headphone, you'll think, well, it looks reasonably flat. It's actually not a bad tuning. But subjectively, I've noticed amongst myself, my roommate, and a few other people that I've given these headphones to try out, we all come away with a slightly different impression of the upper treble region, somewhere in the 7 to 9K region. Some of us perceive there to be some spikes and some unevenness. Some of us perceive there to be no issues at all. So I think that this is a great way of tuning a headphone. I really like what Meze has done here. On the other hand, it seems like there's more variability based on person to person, in my small sample size at least, than there is in the measurements. There are things that some people were hearing that clearly weren't in the measurements and that I or other people were not necessarily perceiving to be the case. That said, overall, I think that the tuning, I don't want to emphasize how much of an issue this is. It's going to depend on how much you like the particular tuning. Now, we'll talk a little bit about who might like this tuning. Personally, it's actually not to my preference. I would prefer a much flatter tuning, something which adheres at least somewhat more closely to the Harman curve. Generally, I like to see a little more sub-bass. I like to see a little bit more flatter mid-range. The effect for me is something that tends to be a little mid-rangey and a little bit lacking in that 2K presence region. And it just feels like there's too much low mids in this sort of a tuning. That said, I think that for $2,000, the Poet offers a pretty good amount of resolution and texture. It does a good job of complementing that sort of distant, laid-back vocal sound that you get by depressing 2K with a nice, rich tonality. There's a fairly good quality dynamics. You get a fairly macro dynamic quality. I wouldn't say that microdynamics are really the strongest suit of this particular headphone in its price class, but in general, resolution is actually quite good. The bass is reasonably tight for, again, the price point. And I think that overall, the level of sort of less tangible sound quality on offer. Harmonic distortion is low. There's a lot of detail. Transients come off relatively clean. I think those qualities are all good. For me, one other thing that doesn't work as well, though, is that Meze headphones tend to feel a little slower and a little bit sort of softer and maybe some would say richer, but I would probably say a little bit warmer or duller in their transient response. These are not lightning fast, super quick, super sort of aggressive headphones. Now, my reference personally is the Focal Utopias. I prefer that sort of more forward, punchy, kind of clear transient sound. I really like a lot of cleanness to the decay and the transients. The Meze headphones tend to feel like they're just a little bit slower and just a little bit warmer and richer, a little fuzzier in that department than something like the Focal headphones, which is, again, not to say that the overall effect doesn't work. In fact, I think the overall effect is really good here, especially for people who might be coming to headphones from two-channel. The sound definitely gets out of your head a bit more. There's a nice amount of resolution on offer. And as I mentioned, you still get a little bit of that sparkle up in the very high harmonics area. So let's talk a little bit about amplifier pairings. With my reference, Ferrum OOR and Hypsos stack, this is definitely a good sound. It's fairly neutral. It might not be sort of the most expressive combination, but it's a reasonably good sound. Again, I tend to find on this combo, because it's not extemporizing a lot, there is a little too much of a sense of the lower mids, mid-range, and low end compared to how much I want around that upper mid-range or mid-treble range. But something like the Red October from Amps & Sound that I also have sounds fantastic with these headphones. If you're the kind of person who really likes a sort of lush, rich tonality, I would say that it tends to lean a little too far in that direction for my tastes, a little too soft in the top end when paired with a tube amp, especially on a higher impedance tap. But some people might really like that. I found that there's a lot of people, depending on your listening level, who do like headphones which have a much softer response in the treble than what is probably about totally neutral if we take a reference level of, say, 80 to 85 decibels, right? And this is where things get kind of interesting, because you've got a lot of variability also based on how loud you're listening. Those equal loudness contours start to come in. And if you tend to listen a little louder, you might not want a headphone which is lightning quick, perhaps even a little ruthless in detail, and really, sort of linear, but potentially a little bit too revealing in the top end. If that describes you and you're the kind of listener who likes to sort of sit back, relax, hear a very spacious sound, you tend to like a warmer response, you like tube amps, that sort of thing, I think the Poet could be really interesting. Something that might match well with it would be any of the Felix OTL amps. Those are going to extremely exaggerate, though, that treble filtering downwards due to the impedance. So that combination might be something that, again, is very warm. Something like an Amps & Sound, for example, which has some opportunity to use lower impedance outputs, will probably give you a little bit more linear response. And I tend to favor that sound, even with tube amps, a little bit more. But again, this is going to be something that's kind of up to your personal preferences. Overall, at $2,000, what do I think about these? I think these are a reasonably decent value. Personally, I would probably pick something more like a Clear MG, or maybe one of the Odyssey headphones, like an LCD2 or maybe an MM500 in this range, just because I tend to like that more linear, sort of more even sound. But one thing I do like about the Mezes is that they are very forgiving. They make even relatively poor quality recordings actually softer and sort of a little slower and a little bit richer and juicier. So I think there's a real place for these. They're not my personal preference, but I think that they're actually a reasonable value at the price point. And it is nice to see more brands coming out with things that aren't $4, $5, $6, $7, $8,000 plus dollars, especially in the headphone realm as it is today, where prices, of course, are always going up. So overall, I think the Meze Poet is a reasonably good entry into their lineup. And I think that for this headphone, it's one that's really carried by the sort of intangibles. Is the quality of its dynamics and is the quality of its particular tuning something that's to your taste? Do you appreciate the build quality and the cables and all of that sort of thing? And are you someone who maybe uses something like a tube amplifier and might listen to more acoustic music that's a little bit more laid back? That's all about the Meze Poet. Stay tuned for more headphone reviews and other reviews coming out soon, and I'll see you next time.